language learning activity, but one which I think can benefit from just a tiny amount of performance. So the students would be given cards at random, and 2 of the cards would match up, and the students had to go around the room discussing with each other in order to find out who their perfect partner was. And so the card on the left and the card on the right here match. The person on the left is a musician, they like fashion and rock music, and the person on the right is an actor, they like the guitar, they like kind of nice shirts and trousers. And so the students have to talk to each other, have to spontaneously come up with questions, and have to spontaneously come up with answers to those questions in order to work out if they're matched, if they're meant for each other. Now, I found that when students were dressing up, that was immediately more effective. Immediately they knew who to head towards in order to speak to, just not because they necessarily matched with the cards, but because the person was dressed particularly eccentrically and stuff, or whatever. And we, in the university, don't have a dressing up box or anything, but I think just something small like an object. I've tried it where I've given students the card before the class where we were going to do it, and they have to bring in one object which represents their personality. That way they can prepare themselves slightly. They know they're going to have to talk about that object, and so they have some comfort. They're not going in completely blind. But it also makes the questions that other people make even more spontaneous, because they're going to have to ask questions about objects which they might not know the words for. They might have to say, why have you brought in this? What is this? And so they're having conversations and actually learning from each other, rather than saying things which are entirely prepared. And the speed dating thing, this is it in its most basic form. It can become more advanced. This is one from an ESL lesson that I've taken for non-Spanish speakers. And so you can have far more advanced personality traits. You can be a lot more or a lot less specific with exactly what the characteristics are in order to encourage a bit more higher order thinking, in order to make the students come up with questions which aren't quite as obvious. And I don't think it needs to be limited to personality. I don't think it needs to be limited to speed dating proper. You can change the topic and have people matching or discussing about jobs, obviously. You could do it for environmental problems. You can do it for all manner of things, as long as you write their profiles in an appropriate way. Linking to that, and keeping on the dating theme, hot seating. So this is just a worksheet that I would use, a very simple worksheet describing a terrible date in order to practice the preterite tense in Spanish. And it was written for 12-year-olds, it would have to be adapted for our students, but it's a man who describes going on a date with a girl and everything went wrong. He says, normally I liked going to the cinema, but I didn't because we didn't get anything to drink and we didn't have any popcorn. After that, they went to a cafe, but he found the girl very boring because she only talked about her dog. After that, the weather was horrible, and then they went to a cake shop and bought a cake, but the girl ate more than half the cake, and so he's upset about that. And then my worksheet runs through the normal meeting the language, the new vocabulary based on cognates, then manipulating the language, so we have these structures, how to say how with an adjective in Spanish, how to say the worst thing, the best thing, the most important thing in Spanish. So they manipulate the language in order to form their own phrases, in order to use that language themselves, and then they make the language their own with 5 extra activities in the preterite that they did on the date. And normally I would leave it here, but by the time they've completed this worksheet or an equivalent worksheet, the students have internalized a lot of the ideas. They know what happened on this date between this guy and this girl, and they can remember quite a lot of it. And so at that point, by closing the exercise book or by taking away the worksheet and making them talk about it, the students are actually able to express themselves. They're actually able to say things without anything in front of them, and then they can develop the storyline from there. So first of all, I'd have them in groups of 4. I'd always have my students in groups of 4. One of them could be the boy, and they could quiz him. They could say, kind of, why is it such a problem that we didn't get Coca-Cola and popcorn. Why didn't you get it if you wanted it? Asking these additional questions beyond the text, and the student has to respond. And then another student can be the girl, and I mean, generally they would say kind of, why did you only talk about your dog, and kind of go on the attack. And the other student has to defend herself and say, well, I didn't because. And so we're still using the preterite, we're still sticking to the aims of the class, but we're going beyond it. We've left behind formalized language where we're really concerned about grammar, where we're really concerned about accuracy, and now we're encouraging the students to just have a bit more fun and to say what they want to say in Spanish. The next activity is a balloon debate. This is an activity which is based around the idea that students are all a figure, are all an important character in whichever field you're studying. So here I've just taken people from the general media and entertainment. And they are all in a hot air balloon together and they're floating off. But the hot air balloon is sinking. And so in order to save the lives of 3, they have to throw out 1. And the students have to have an argument, a debate, in order to decide who is the least important, who is the least significant to history, and that person gets pushed overboard. And for this, I would generally give students some time to prepare, especially if we're doing it based on, say, Hispanic figures. They could do some research in advance. And then some preparation time where they're going to think, why am I significant? I wouldn't make them do it entirely spontaneously, because I think for me now it would be very difficult to make an argument. So I do give them some thinking time, with the intention that when students throw questions at them in order to criticize them or in order to say why they are more important than their friends, then they're going to have to deal with unknown language. Then they're going to have to deal with something which they haven't seen before. And again, I find the students really like this because it's a competition, because they can push each other, they know what they want to say in English, and I think whenever the students know what they want to say in English, then we're winning, because then they have something that they want to express and they will go to anything they can, any measure they can in order to express that. And it won't always be grammatically correct. I think this is where we have to turn a blind eye to mistakes and think, well, they're expressing themselves, they're communicating in the language. And as we build grammar and as we build accuracy in tandem, if we can build fluency, then hopefully at some point they will meet and our students will be speaking fluently and grammatically correctly. But certainly I think accuracy will improve the more students do it, because they just get more used to using the expressions. I'm flying through these quite quickly, I don't think I'll be the full hour. But Quiz Trade is another activity which I love using. It's a Kagan activity designed to improve language learning through collaborative work. And generally it's used for either grammar or for questions where there are right and wrong answers. So, for example, here the question, do you like sciences? And the students have to correctly use the phrase, I like sciences. They have to conjugate the verb correctly and then give a reason. And so each student will have a card and will find a partner, and one of the students will ask the question in bold. The other student will answer, and if they answer correctly, if they answer grammatically correctly, their partner will congratulate them in Spanish, and then they will be asked the question from their partner's card. If, however, they make a mistake, then the other student will coach them and will not give them the answer, but will say, well, did you conjugate the verb correctly? And the other student has to think and rework their answer until they get it right. Then, once both students have asked their questions, the students exchange cards, so they've got a new card, and go and find a new partner. They put their hand in the air so they can see who's also free, who's not got a partner at the minute, and work with another. And that way they're working through all of the different cards, so they're not constantly practicing the same question, but also it means that each question they're practicing twice. Each question they're having to answer off the top of their head, and then they're being given the answer card so they can see it. So they're consolidating and reinforcing once they've done it the first time. However, this is focused on accuracy. This is not focused on spontaneity. But it's obviously very easily adaptable to be. And so character cards, for example. Students can be as performative with these as they want. Some students really don't want to be performative and don't want to act out who they are, but with their language they have to. And so it becomes similar to a game of 20 questions, but instead of with closed questions, instead of with yes/no answers, they're with open questions. So the students have to think. If they're asked, why am I famous? They have to say, well, I'm famous because either I'm a boy wizard or because I'm a fictional character, depending on which route they want to take. And by the end of the discussion, the other student has to guess which character it is. When I do things like this, I say there's only 2 questions they can't ask, which is, who are you? And which book are you from? Or which, if it's a media thing, which film or book or piece of art are you from? Because then obviously if a student says I'm from Harry Potter, there's only 4 or 5 characters that it's going to be, really. And so this really gets students talking, because again, they know the answers and they want to express themselves. I've tried it with Hispanic figures and it doesn't work anywhere near as well because the students aren't familiar with them. And so whereas with something like the balloon debate, you can get them to research one figure, with an activity like this, they need to be familiar with as many figures as there are in the classroom. And so I've always had to stick, and it's difficult for me here, I've tried it here, and the number of references between the US and the UK, which are different, is really quite challenging for me to know what characters my students are going to know. And the final activity is not so much performative, but it is spontaneous, and I love it. I use it all the time, and the students, I'm not entirely sure why, are always completely absorbed by it, and it's battleships. The idea that by creating a grid with stimuli on both axes, the students can just have a game of battleships. So I give them the grid, and I get them to draw 6 crosses wherever they want at random, and other students have to form sentences in order to guess where their battleships are. So if I want to guess, for example, that this person has a battleship here, I have to make the sentence, in January it is freezing, or in January it is cold. If a student is correct, then the ship sinks and they get another go. They get to guess where else there is a battleship. If the student is incorrect, then it switches and their partner has to guess where their battleships are, and the winner is the person that sinks the 6 battleships the quickest. And the more crosses you add, the longer it takes the students, and they're constantly engaged the entire time. And it is never a problem that we have too much time in class, but if ever you do have too much time in class, this can extend 5, 10, 15 minutes longer than you wanted, and the students are constantly industrious, forming their own sentences. And it can be as supported or as free and spontaneous as you need. If you have a very weak student that really struggles to cope, you can literally write half the sentence on one axis and half the sentence on the other, and they just read it. If you have very strong students, you can take away and just have pictures in both, and the students have to work out what they're talking about. Something kind of a little less simplistic than a month and a temperature. If you have 2 completely unrelated pictures, and the students have to listen to a little story which is being told in order to know exactly where they're checking. And so I think it's a really nice activity in that it's very easily adaptable and the students do really enjoy it. And that is all of the activities I have. So thank you. Do you have any questions? Or?
Thank you. Please, questions, comments, argument. No bodily assault. But
I have I teach Japanese, and I recently do more like you mentioned about introvert student to try to speak or try, it's this personal trait becomes a little more big deal for me to, recently I tried to and then I started to do some of the stuff, like you kind of write, and then you can speak, so that way, but do you put something writing besides, like it's spontaneous writing, but then you before you start asking to
Yeah.
talk, I sometimes ask students to write about what you think or what do you think food is going to be good about, and then it's those relatively quiet kids, not kids, quiet students also reluctantly, but they speak more. Seems like, do you put something writing beside?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the activity. So a lot of these, they'll be the final part of the learning stage. So we have gone through and done a written activity, and we have gone through and done the vocabulary learning. So it's I wouldn't just throw these on a student at the beginning of the chapter, say, because they do, like you say, need to scaffold, because they need to have some language. Even if we want them to say some things which they can't express, they need to have a base from which they can work. And for something like the balloon debate, where I think the ideas might be quite complicated, as well as the language, I always give them time to do some writing before, just to get their ideas in order. Absolutely. With something like with the battleships, I would give them much less preparation, because it's a lower level order of thinking, because they're using language which is there's a lot of spontaneity involved. It's some spontaneity, but not completely free talking. But I think with very introverted students as well, the great thing about a lot of these activities is if we have all of our students in groups of 4 in lively conversation, there's just noise in the classroom which makes the students feel more comfortable, because they know that they're not being listened to by anybody other than their group. And especially you as a teacher can only be in one place at one time. And so it's not even like they feel you breathing down their back, listening to them and as they maybe see it, judging them. And I think that there's a bit of freedom that it gives them in being in a more lively classroom, because they feel less judged, because they feel that they're not being constantly kind of evaluated.
So on that, I've used something like this with Battleship with great success, I think. But of these other activities, which ones have you found sort of most successful at the first semester level?
Yeah. With this one, I think this is really successful with more fixed responses. When it's completely open, I find it less successful, because the students don't have that base of language from which to work. But with things like the hot seating, I think you can use that with any topic, and because students have read the text, they've worked on the text, they've written answers on the text, they've got that familiarity with it, and so they can push themselves a bit. And then also anything which is anything which excites them a bit more, like the X Factor clips. There's a video of kind of America's Next Top Model fails on YouTube, which I always use for the clothing, because they want to talk about it, because they find it funny. And I think that anything like that which kind of excites them, I find really successful. And there's been no difference there between teaching 21-year-olds and teaching 11-year-olds. They all find the same things funny.
Well, and on that note, I guess kind of following this kind of trail of related questions, since you brought up the kind of age quotient or factor here. So with Gen Z, if we buy into this idea that they want the constant feedback, they want the approbation of the instructor. I got it right, am I getting it right, how close am I to right? What happens in these cases? Because I'm buying your argument. I like the idea of saying, for this activity we're doing this shame-free, make mistakes, just practice, get that fluency, get that confidence in opening your mouth and letting Spanish come out of it. Is there a balance you can strike between giving some feedback to get them to feel that they are making, I don't know, on this kind of like an actful scale, where are they proficiency-wise, without actually saying, you got the past tense wrong here, you should have used this verbal form or something like that. What do you do in correction?
I mean,
or is it really zero correction?
When I'm working around the classroom, I just give positive feedback. I don't, one word, excellent, perfect. I don't give any feedback at all. Afterwards, after the activity, I'll give generalized whole class feedback, where I'll write down a few sentences that they've that I've commonly heard wrong, and then we'll correct them as a class. But during the actual activity, I don't give them anything other than encouragement. But at the beginning of the semester, I do always say there's two parts of language learning. One is getting things right, and one is saying things quickly. And at the beginning, we can't do both at the same time, so we're going to practice them both. And I've not found my students resistant. I've not found them desperate for feedback.
And then unrelated, in a typical average class within your 6-hour schedule, how much time do you spend on this kind of spontaneous speaking? In, say, a given...
I would say, so I try to flip the classroom so any grammatical work is done beforehand, and then a small amount of time at the start of the class is spent clearing up any doubts they might have or any mistakes that might be common in the homework. And then I aim for 60% of the class time to be speaking, because that's the one thing they need us for, that's the one thing they need other people around them to be doing. And the other 40% is split usually between writing and listening. And of the 60%, I would say I would aim for half of that to be spontaneous.
Wow, that's good. That's good. That's good.
The first couple of weeks, obviously, that's not going to happen because you're doing hello, how are you, what's your name? But even by this point in the semester,
Yeah,
a small amount of spontaneity.
thank you.
I was wondering if you feel that these activities were better as a warm